There we go. We do ask that everyone stay muted for the duration of the webinar to help with background noise, and also that you keep your cameras turned off. The reason we have that is just so that we aren't distracted if we have viewers up on the screen, and it can also make an issue with bandwidth. So we've found that sometimes that can make the video quality not so great, and audio as well. So please just keep your videos off. We do have the option for you to type questions in the chat box as Jane is presenting. We'll keep an eye on those questions, and if we're getting flooded, Jane may stop and have us read a few. Otherwise, we will save those for the end of the presentation. We'll try to get to as many questions as we possibly can before 8 o'clock. But if we don't get to your question, Jane has agreed to have people reach out to both us and to her if you have a burning question that didn't get answered tonight. Tomorrow, we will be sending you an evaluation. Please let us know what you thought about our webinar, and also gives you the opportunity to give us some feedback and possibly what you'd like to see in webinars in the future. We love to get that feedback. I'm always wondering what you guys want to hear about. And we also will have the recording of this available to you as well in case you want to share it with others or watch again in case you missed something. Quick little background on New Hampshire Lakes if you're not familiar with us. We're the only publicly supported nonprofit organization working for all of New Hampshire's 1,000 lakes. If you can believe it, I didn't know we had 1,000 lakes before I started working here. You can certainly become a supporter and be a hero for our lakes today right on our website at newhampshirelakes.org. And our mission, which we just recently changed, is to restore and preserve the health of New Hampshire's lakes. Up until recently, it was for clean and healthy lakes, and we can no longer pretend that all of our lakes are clean and healthy, unfortunately. So we are shifting a little bit and just acknowledging that we do need to restore many of our lakes and to preserve them for the future. And the way we're doing that is through our three program areas. One is through advocacy, which is right in the height of it right now. If you are interested in giving your lake a voice, you can reach out to Andrea Lamoureux. She's our president and policy advocate. See how you can give your lake a voice. We also have our conservation program, which is our pretty well-known lake host program, helping boaters learn how to clean, drain, and dry their boats before they come into and leave our lakes. And also our Lake Smart, Lake Friendly Living program, which is for any homeowner, regardless if you live on the lake or miles from it, things you can do on your own property to help protect the lake through runoff, products you're using in your home, the types of vegetation you're growing. The list goes on and on. It's fascinating. You can do a 15-minute free survey online, and we give you a personalized report instantaneously. I strongly suggest everybody partake in that. And of course, our outreach program, which is bringing you our webinar series tonight, and also our good program, Lakes Congress, which will be happening in June. We will be having more information about that. You can keep an eye on our website for registration to be opening in the next couple of months. I'm your host this evening, Erin Mastine. I'm our outreach coordinator. Gloria Norcross is joining us as well to help me man the chat box as Jane is presenting. She's our conservation program assistant. And without further ado, I turn it over to Jane. Thank you so much for joining us. And I will stop sharing my screen so you can get on with the good stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Erin. I'm really just thrilled to be asked. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. She says confidently. So this is a talk that I've developed over several years, but it's not one that I wrote originally. It's one that was written at a place where I worked for a dozen years, Old Colony History Museum. But I want to thank Aaron and also the folks at Brookline Historical Society, Brookline, New Hampshire Historical Society, Eric D. Virgilio, Peter Webb, and George Winters, and also the late Pat Burke, whose oral history about working in the ice industry was recorded in 1991, and thank you to the recorder. So every time I give this talk, I add local content to it, and you need to understand that I work in the flatlands of coastal southern Rhode Island, and so it was a fun foray for me to look into New Hampshire history. I work for Historic New England, which is the oldest and largest regional heritage organization in the nation. And I'm lucky to be the site manager for 2 historic working farms that together have 565 acres. And both of these have some evidence of ice harvesting in the past that I'll show you as we go along. Well, Historic New England has 38 historic sites altogether, including 5 in New Hampshire. There's Jackson House, Langdon House, and Runlet May House in Portsmouth, and then Gilman Garrison House in Exeter, and Barrett House in New Ipswich. And each one is open on varying days from June through mid-October. And members get to tour all 38 of our properties for free, and there are many other benefits to membership, and you can visit our website. And if you're already a member of Historic New England, thank you very much. And I'd like to invite you to become one if you're not already. And if you're already a member or supporter of other nonprofits like New Hampshire Lakes Brookline Historical Society, which has a large collection of ice harvesting that you can enjoy in person or online, or Old Colony History Museum, I know that they're all grateful for your support. So this is where the talk originated, Old Colony History Museum in Taunton, Massachusetts, a mid-sized city that is on the south coast of Massachusetts. It was written first by my colleague, Jane E. McCambra, and she wrote it in the 1990s after having gone to an ice harvesting demonstration by the National Ice Harvesting Club in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and learning the ice harvester's 11th commandment. Thou shalt not carelessly allow thy tools to drop to the bottom of the pond. So we'll be careful as we go on. Our topic this winter evening is the once commonplace activity of ice harvesting. We'll go through the process from lake to icebox, through time from ancient days to today, and talk about the importance of ice in everyday life in New England, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Most of us are not very familiar with the idea of harvesting ice, but perhaps you've seen the movie Frozen, which opens with ice harvesting, or perhaps you've read Farmer Boy by Laura Ingalls Wilder, which has a whole chapter about it. And most of us are so accustomed to our electric refrigerators and all of our processed food that we take year-round access to cold drinks and ice cream for granted. So with electric refrigeration, we don't need to give the problem of food preservation a second thought until the power goes out. Our ancestors certainly had to think about ways to preserve food long, long ago, or they never would have survived. In China, people were storing ice before 1100 BCE, and a cuneiform tablet records the building of an ice house in Mesopotamia in 1780 BCE. In America, before the American Revolution, the use of ice for food preservation was not widespread. It was a luxury item. After the war and at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, more and more people were moving from farming in the country to factories in the city, and therefore away from ready sources of fresh food. So chilling food to make it last longer became more important than ever. So what did people do before they chilled shelf life? Here we have an example of a spring house where water runs through the basement part of this little building. It's built into the side of the hill at Watson Farm in Jamestown, Rhode Island, where I also work. So certainly using natural water and the weather outdoors when it was cool enough were ways to keep food fresh. But how about uh, just the good old root cellars, right? You could boil food, you could bury it underground. There was canning, pickling, drying, smoking, salting, curing, and jellying, fermenting, and then the use of oils, vinegar, lye, spices, herbs, honey, and sugar were all methods of preservation. In Jamestown, they sort of had an in-between method for the milk that came from the local dairy cows, because they would put it here in the spring house and let it get a little bit funky, because funky cheese from naturally occurring good bacteria was a product from Jamestown, Rhode Island. Well, the use of ice meant more fresh foods. Less food products need to be treated in these time-consuming ways. And I don't know about you, but some of them don't seem that appetizing either, like fluid beef. However, in the last decade or so, I'm sure you've noticed there's been a resurgence of interest in pickling and canning and fermenting, which you can find in many farmers markets, including ours at Casey Farm. In the mid-18th century, only the wealthy had ice houses, including Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So here's the ice well that's at Mount Vernon. You can see that it's built into a little hill. Washington's diary in 1785 included this entry: "Having put in the heavy frame into my ice house, I began this day to seal it with boards, and to ram straw between those boards and the wall." So that's a basic way to insulate your ice house. Ice was a luxury item, as I said, and most often used to make delicacies like ice cream or ices that they had in between courses that they'd learned about in Europe. But even on the Potomac, enslaved people on Washington's plantation could reportedly capture floating chunks of ice to fill up the ice well because the river didn't freeze over solid. Toward the end of the 18th century, ice houses or ice cellars became more common on farms from Virginia northward, where fresh water regularly froze solid in the winter and where there was generally abundant pure water. And today we know this is a little more difficult because of climate change and because of pollution. But back in those days, harvesting ice was a community affair, also providing local residents with a chance to socialize. It meant the snow got cleared from the ice so kids could skate or slide around, and it was an occasion for get-togethers and good food and drink. As you can see in this close-up of the Currier and Ives lithograph print, which is of course an idealized look back, it shows that the basic equipment was simple: handheld saws and axes for cutting the blocks, picks for floating it, and horses and sleighs for transporting it to the ice house. Much like bringing in the hay, cutting ice was part of the agricultural year and as much work as harvesting a crop, so it required at least a few people to help. Some farmers considered it the first crop of the year, being harvested right around now in January and February. Also, as the new republic grew by leaps and bounds, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, the American population boomed and the demand for ice increased. So nearly every New England town had at least one small ice harvesting operation in the 19th century. Then along came entrepreneurs like Frederick Tudor from Boston, who was the first to see the opportunity to make a big profit from ice. He soon became known as the Ice King, and his motto, "I have so willed it," proves that the ice industry suited his personality. He began exporting ice from New England to points south in the first decade of the 19th century. Tudor's development of above-ground ice houses, which could store large quantities during the spring and summer, and his commissioning of the first horse-drawn ice plows would revolutionize the industry, and we'll take a closer look at both of those innovations a little later. By the middle of the 19th century, the bucolic winter social activity had become a whirlwind of industry. Spy Pond, a deep kettle hole in Arlington, Massachusetts, produced an estimated 75,000 tons of ice in 1864 alone, and this was one of several Tudor Ice Company ponds in the Commonwealth, as was the famous Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts. In New Hampshire, Tudor expanded his harvesting operations to Milton, where starting in 1858, special ice trains carried up to 50 cars full a day to Boston. One of Tudor's companies, Fresh Pond Ice, moved harvesting operations from Massachusetts to Brookline, New Hampshire to get ice from the pristine 138-acre and 27-foot deep Lake Potanipo in the 1890s, and I'll weave in its history as we go. I got a lot of great information from their website, from the members there, and from oral histories of Pat Burke. He started working for Fresh Pond Ice Company in 1916 for 9 years, he said. Well, throughout the country in 1886, there were over 25 million tons of ice harvested. By the late 19th century, the labor of thousands of people and approximately $30 million was invested in the business of harvesting, storing, and selling ice in this country. Ice at that time, the late 19th century, was the second largest export from the U.S., and of course cotton was number one. As the industry became standardized around the time of the Civil War, both the commercial ice houses and many local farmers followed the same basic procedures when harvesting ice. As I said, it was harvested in January or February after the lakes, ponds, or rivers had frozen to between 8 and 12 inches thick. If necessary, the area to be cut was cleared of snow using shovels or a horse-drawn scraper. A stormy winter would cause expensive delays for the commercial ice houses. Later, tractors were adapted to become snowplows like this Cleat-Track from Fresh Pond Ice Company in Brookline. Pat Burke described how after it snowed 5 or 6 inches, they would score the ice around the snow, allow the snow to sink into the lake, and let it refreeze with clean ice. A few inches of snow were scraped from the ice into the channels if there was any new snow. Once cleared, the ice field was measured off in a grid or checkerboard pattern of several ice cakes, often 22 inches by 44 inches. And this was done by using a marker plow with a swinging guide, which made 3-inch deep cuts. The swinging guide would be placed in the line previously cut to ensure that the next set would be 22 inches apart from it. Here's a great image from Brookline Historical Society of 3 plow teams, each with 1 person to lead the horse and 1 to guide the plow. The horses were equipped with spiked shoes. I hope you can just see the spiked shoes on the horse in this image. So the spiked shoes would help them to trot on ice more safely, and at least 4 inches of ice were needed to support the weight of a horse. More on this topic later. After the marking plow, the horse-drawn ice plow then followed the incised lines again and cut the ice an additional 6 to 12 inches, or approximately 2/3 of the way through the depth. You'll notice that, like the marker plow, each of the ice plow's blades is slightly longer than the one preceding it, all the better to slice through the ice like a razor. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, is the person who invested first in this time-saving way to cut ice, but it was his ingenious young foreman, Nathaniel Wyeth, who invented this system before 1825. Wyeth had been a hotel owner in Cambridge, and then in midlife he was a trailblazer and explorer of America's West. But he came back to the ice industry in Cambridge at the end of his life and made most of his fortune in the ice industry, having filed 14 patents related to improving the harvesting of ice. Wyeth's system was used to cut ice well into the 20th century in places like Brookline, but at the turn of the 20th century, power saws like the Fergus Falls rotary ice cutting machine were developed that could operate at speeds of up to 100 feet a minute while cutting through 12 inches of ice. Some were powered at first by steam engine and then by gasoline. It was said that one power saw could replace 5 horseplow teams. Despite the dangerous machine, apparently kids still thought that ice cutting was an invitation to have fun. Although mechanized tools could lessen the amount of time and number of people needed to harvest the ice crop, many tasks continued to be done by people with hand tools: the ice saw, ice tongs, ice gaff, and ice pick. And here you can see those tools in action at a small farming operation at the Eustis Estate in Milton, Massachusetts in 1894. These workers apparently did not have the benefit of horsepower and did the clearing by shovel, marking and maneuvering with ice picks and cutting with a saw. And tongs aided in getting the block into the ice house. Whatever the harvesting method, the desired result was black ice, they called it, a clear, clean, and bubble-free product. At the Milton Estate, children of the workers there remembered cooling melons in that ice house in the summertime and then enjoying them while sitting on the cold blocks of ice. An ingenious hybrid method for using an engine to cut ice was told to me by Richard Alphin of Jamestown, Rhode Island. He said that in the early 20th century on Baker's Island, a small island near Salem, Massachusetts, where he grew up, the lighthouse keeper and a carpenter figured out how to use a Model T Ford's engine to score the ice and then power the conveyor belt into the ice house. And I'm sure a lot of people made similar adaptations. Well, in this print of a large commercial operation, the worker on the left is holding a long ice pick, or you could call it a hook or a pike, which was used to float large sheets of ice from the field into an open channel. The worker in the center is using an ice saw to cut the large sheets free. Pat Burke said that the Fresh Pond Ice Company sheets were 5 blocks across. Along with chisels, ice saws were used to split off individual cakes from the sheets. Those farmers and small operators who didn't have ice plows used ice saws for all of their cutting. And here are 2 Fresh Pond Ice Company employees showing how it was done in Brookline. And here are 2 ice picks and a chisel that were used on Lake Potanipo in Brookline, and workers holding chisels when they were in regular use. I understand they have a large collection of tools at Brookline Historical Society, and more on how they got them later. Open channels in the water were cut to allow the ice cakes to be pushed toward the ice house. And here we can see those large ice sheets being floated from the field to the open channel. At Fresh Pond Ice, one nighttime worker would drive what they called a steamboat to keep the channels open. This channel was the easiest way to move those double blocks along with pikes. Pat Burke also described that some kids liked riding the ice cakes down the channels. These workers are pushing the sheets closer to the ice house. The sheets would then be split into individual cakes, each weighing approximately 200 pounds. And in large commercial operations like this one, they could weigh upwards of 300 pounds. And the cakes were fed up into the ice house by means of a pulley-operated conveyor belt. Another great image and information from Brookline, these workers are shown inside a covered passage leading to the conveyor belt outside one of their ice houses, and they had quite an extensive system there. Well, this entire operation did not always go smoothly, and an obvious danger was that people or horses would fall into the icy water. They'd be pulled out as quickly as possible using ropes and planks. The story from a man in Jamestown was that it was his job when he was a kid to help local ice harvesters to make sure that a rescued horse would gallop itself dry. Helen Steer Brown, who was born in 1903, wrote a book called Looking Back that describes life in Gloucester, Rhode Island in the early 1900s. And one anecdote from that book is about Jumbo, the Steer family horse, falling through the ice while working. So I'll quote it here. Everyone rushed to the rescue. They grabbed the poor creature by the harness, mane, and perhaps even the tail and pulled. Somehow they got a rope around his neck. Everyone heaved, trying not to slide in themselves, and they pulled him up and got him onto the ice. They got him up on his feet, rubbed him down vigorously, put blankets over him, gave him some brandy, and walked him around for an hour or more to keep him from stiffening up. They then took him up to the barn, rubbed him down again, put new blankets over him, and fed him. The horse seemed none the worse for this wintry adventure, and everyone else went back to finishing the job. Pat Burke from Brookline said horses would go into the ice sometimes, but they would get them out and had similar methods for reviving them. But one time they lost a tractor in the deep water. Unfortunately, the driver escaped. A less exciting job for young people was Shine Boy, who cleaned up after the horses and poured formaldehyde on the ice in an effort to keep it hygienic. But perhaps the most dangerous jobs in the ice industry were held by the switchers. With handheld pikes, these people were responsible for routing the heavy, slippery cakes once they slid down the ramp into the ice house. As the cakes slid in, the switchers would push them away from the chutes to their co-workers who placed them in layers on the ice house floor. Speed was important because at large ice houses, 300-pound cakes could zoom in at the rate of 1 per second. In this manner, layer by layer, the ice house would be filled from floor to ceiling. Here a crew pushes the cakes with pikes and lines them up like tiles on a floor. No insulation between the cake layers was necessary if it was cold enough. Pat Burke, for example, said that on the top layers, the cracks were sealed with wax paper, and then the whole pile was topped with hay. They could be chiseled apart later if necessary. For easier handling and storage, it was important that all the cakes were of uniform thickness. So one of the ways to ensure this was to use a mechanical planer, which was easier to do after the invention of the gasoline engine. And you can see a big pile of ice shavings under the trestle. Commercial ice houses could be hundreds of feet long, about the size of a football field, and multi-storied. But perhaps the biggest of them all was the Fresh Pond Ice House in Brookline. The switchers inside had to use a conveyance track because the place was so big. Pat Burke said the track went through the first 4 ice houses. Fresh Pond Ice had 13 ice house sections built together, each 6 stories high and insulated, then 4 additional stacks at the end. Eric at Brookline Historical Society estimated that the size was 250 feet wide by 900 feet long, and it was said to have been the largest ice house under one roof in the world. In its heyday in the early 20th century, they could store over 80,000 pounds at one time, but they would harvest in a season well over 100,000 pounds because they would put the first cutting often directly into train cars that went to Cambridge and Somerville, Mass. They employed over 300 workers in the summertime, some of whom came up from Massachusetts, some locals, and some itinerant workers, including indigenous people, according to Pat Burke. Inexpensive softwoods like hemlock, spruce, and white pine were used to build most New England ice houses. like this little one with a ventilated roof on Long Island in Boston Harbor. The salt marsh hay provided good insulation over the top of the ice and a good way to keep the day's catch fresh. Small farms, especially dairies, benefited from small ice storage houses on their properties because their products could stay fresh longer and both could be delivered together. And this one is from a 19th century farm in Rehoboth, and the green arrow points to the ice house door, which is up high so that you could get to the ice once it was stacked up there. Sometimes the houses were painted white like this one, or whitewashed to reflect the summer sun. Or how about this fancy pink Gothic revival one at Roseland Cottage in Connecticut? So you can see it also has a low and a high door. If stored correctly, there was enough ice for all the summertime parties in there. You can see in the open door that non-heat conducting materials like sawdust or straw were used between an inner and outer wall of the ice for insulation. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, found that sawdust was the best insulator, or rather I should say that his foreman Nathaniel Wyeth figured out that sawdust was the best insulator. Additional sawdust or straw was often packed around the stored ice, and that's a good reason why rural ice businesses were often paired with sawmills and with farms. At Casey Farm, where I am now, the ice house was built into a little hill to take advantage of the natural insulation of the earth, as you can see in this 1877 image. Today there's a carriage house built on top of it, but still you can access the ice storage and root cellar below. Well, here's the fanciest image of an ice house that I found in Historic New England's archives. It's an 1820 print for an ice well, which was a more common term for an ice house in Great Britain and elsewhere around the world. And it really shows how ice was a luxury item in many places. For industrial ice production, a good way to move the blocks was the railroad. Fresh Pond Ice had 75 special ice train cars for transport to Cambridge and Somerville. They would cut the ice from the lake and load it directly into the cars for the first cutting of the winter, as I said. And using train lines, other ice storage facilities, even in the deep south, were able to have the benefits of cold storage from New England water sources. A good ice storage facility like in Brookline could keep ice frozen through the warm weather months until it was time to harvest ice again. And I have an illustration to show the surprising durability of stored ice. This mountain of ice was left after a July 1912 fire at the aptly named Mountain Ice Company of New Jersey. The remaining pile was 50 feet high. It took several weeks in the hot summer sun for this ice to melt completely. And fire was always a problem at the wooden ice houses filled with combustible sawdust and hay, as was the occasional collapse under the weight of the ice. And for these reasons, and obsolescence, few ice houses remain today. And that was the fate of the largest ice house in the world from Brookline, New Hampshire. The business suffered in the 1930s, so there were few employees left, but the whole place went up in flames on March 22, 1935. Pat Burke described how courageous ice workers with cleats on their boots climbed on neighbors' roofs and doused them down so cinders did not catch the houses on fire too. There was one surviving building out of the complex, a former boarding house for some of those out-of-town workers, and it's now used by Camp Tevye. So summer campers can enjoy the lake and a little bit of history remains in good condition. And a lot of that history remains at Brookline Historical Society because years after the 1935 fire, a local diver recovered many ice harvesting tools from the bottom of Lake Potanipo, and they're now in the collection, and you can go and see them. Frederick Tudor, the Ice King, transported his ice by ship to Charleston and New Orleans in the early 19th century, But Tudor had an even bolder idea to export the products of the New England winter to India, Singapore, and the West Indies when he was just 24 years old. In February of 1806, the Boston Gazette reported, "No joke, a vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation." At first, people in the tropics needed to be introduced to the product, so Tudor would give away free samples. He did end up selling whatever ice that didn't melt on that first 3-week voyage. And ice in the tropics was used by people like plantation owners who used the labor of enslaved people. And so they could enjoy cold drinks and desserts like ice cream. Tudor complained that no one followed his instructions for ice storage, and his early voyages failed, but he went on to be more successful selling ice in places like Havana and Calcutta. Henry David Thoreau, watching a crew of Tudor ice cutters at Walden Pond in the winter of 1846 to 47, recorded these remarks in his journal. "The sweltering inhabitants of Charleston and New Orleans, of Madras and Bombay and Calcutta, drink at my well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges." Tudor wrote an icehouse diary beginning in 1805 at the start of his career and began with this gem: "He who gives back at the first repulse and without striking the second blow despairs of success, has never been, is not, and never will be a hero in war, love, or business." Tudor did have a couple of stints in debtor's prison, but he ended up making a fortune by mid-century as technology improved. He gloated in his icehouse diary later in his career. "The frost covers the windows, the wheels creak, the boys run, winter rolls, and $50,000 worth of ice floats for me upon Fresh Pond." And of course, he was referring to Fresh Pond in Cambridge that was privately owned by Tudor, but that was later the name given to the ice company in Brookline. It seems incredible, but some ice was considered so pure that it became a luxury item overseas. Ice from Wenham Lake in the North Shore of Massachusetts had a royal warrant from Queen Victoria in the 1840s, and it was sold all over England and Ireland. Soon, Mrs. Beeton from the famous cookbook created a cocktail made with Wenham Lake ice only, called the pineapple julep. As industrialization grew in America, the natural ice industry gave way to the artificial ice industry. On this 1890s trade journal, it helped to spread the news about advances in the field. As industrialization grew, so did pollution of the waterways, and as early as the 1880s, it was recognized that artificial ice was often more sanitary. Production techniques eventually brought costs lower than that of natural ice, and especially in the South, artificial ice was preferred. An ice plant like this one in El Paso, Texas, could produce as much as 50 tons of ice every day. Electric freezers were patented by Florida resident John Gorey in 1851, but he was not taken seriously in his lifetime, and so they didn't make it into people's homes then. Frederick Tudor, for example, considered the idea of mechanized ice to be ridiculous and never would convert his business from natural harvesting. He died in 1864 as one of the country's first millionaires. For many years in the North, except for the occasional warm winter, natural ice continued to be a viable product well into the 20th century, as it was in Brookline. Especially in New England, with its abundant water supplies, wooden ice boxes a century ago could be filled inexpensively with local natural ice. If the New England winter could not freeze the ice deeply enough, one alternative was more expensive ice from Canada. In many smaller towns, there were farmers who worked together or who took ice from ponds or at streams that were dammed up. Newspapers throughout New England carried news about ice conditions, which were vital for farmers to know when to cut ice. According to sources in Rehoboth, Massachusetts, the Cushing family from this town had a formula they used to know when to cut ice: February 8th or 8 inches. That meant harvesting began as soon as um, there was at least 8 inches of ice, or if the ice was not deep enough that year, they harvested whatever they could by February 8th. After that date, they thought the spring thaw almost always ruined the ice for harvesting purposes, in southern New England anyway. But Pat Burke said that they usually got at least 12 inch thick blocks, which were planed down to 11 inches, and they would keep harvesting right into March. In the city of Taunton, there were some farmers like that, but also small distributors. Taunton city directories from over a century ago showed there were 6 different ice dealers and wholesale companies. In many cases, the ice was harvested locally and delivered by horse and wagon to all parts of the city. East Taunton native Charles D. Purse established his ice and woodcutting business in 1896. Mr. Purse ran from 6 to 8 ice teams in the city during the summer delivery season. His grandson told me that the summer months were not only delivery season, but that the ponds needed to be maintained during that time. If the vegetation wasn't cut back along the edges of the ponds, it made a good habitat for muskrats, and they burrow into the banks of ponds, and they could swim underneath the ice as it froze and ruin the product. Pat Burke recounted how the small summer workforce would clean and repair the ice houses in Brookline and get them ready for the next season. The company kept about a stable of about 200 horses as well, that they would move back and forth between Brookline and Somerville. So when it was delivery season, Coursey Brothers Ice Company of Taunton, founded in the early 20th century, sorry, we're not delivering yet. Coursey Brothers was founded in the early 20th century, and they operated 2 ice houses on the lakes nearby. The ice house had a total capacity of 8,000 tons. The multi-storied wooden house was divided into 4 storage rooms. It was insulated with sawdust, as we've seen in other ice houses, and 4 feet of straw was placed on top of the stored ice, but you always had to leave space for air circulation above the ice to keep it sweet or free from mold and mildew. During World War II, like many industries, Coursey Brothers experienced a labor shortage, so they came up with a creative solution. 35 Catholic brothers from La Salette Shrine in Attleboro were brought in to assist. Now we're delivering. Late spring marked the beginning of the 7-month ice delivery service for the Courseys. Until 1929, 4 double-team wagons would arrive at the ice house early in the morning. Using a tool similar to this ice shaver, this floor shaver, the Courseys would separate and push the 200-pound blocks from the back of the building to the front and load them into wagons for the icemen to deliver. And the shaver was their multi-purpose tool. Pat Burke described how they used a system of runs and ramps to make the ice slide just right into the waiting train cars. Then they went to Massachusetts, where they were distributed by several different delivery services. Here's an ad for the delivery of fresh pond ice in Boston that was harvested in Brookline, New Hampshire. And there were many delivery companies dotted throughout New England, often paired, as I said, with wood, coal, milk, or produce delivery. And I'm sure that the delivery person's everyday experiences were similar. Once they reached the first stop, they would walk behind the wagons to save time for the rest of the route. Mr. Coursey said, "Those horses knew the routes better than the men." And here we have, like many other companies, rectangular cardboard signs. Here's the one for Fresh Pond Ice Company, front and back. Customers would display in their front windows, and depending on what side they put up, the ice delivery person would know the amount they wanted. I found another Fresh Pond ice card just like this one on the National Park Service's website for the John F. Kennedy birthplace in Cambridge. So Lake Potanipo ice cooled little Jack Kennedy's drinks. Ice scales like this one were used at the ice house and also on every wagon. But the mark of a good ice delivery person was the ability to cut off just the right size within a pound or two without weighing it. By doing some on-the-spot calculations based on the fact that a cubic foot of ice weighs 58 pounds, the Iceman or Ice Woman, like these two from 1918, could estimate the size of the block to be delivered. Placing a block in a leather sling or using ice tongs, he or she carried it to the house. Meanwhile, what fun it was for kids to steal a piece of refreshing ice from the back of the wagon on a hot summer day. The destination for the block of ice inside the kitchen or often on a porch was the icebox. Here's a great illustration of a full 1930s icebox. The Iceman has just used his sling to deliver the fresh blocks. I don't know what he's doing with the eggs now, but maybe he delivered those too. But you can see the ice compartment is in the top. Ice boxes were made since the 1830s. Before then, apparently they used small insulated boxes with just a piece of ice on top of it that they called refrigerator boxes, but don't confuse those with the glass refrigerator boxes that were used in the early 20th century. So you can see the inside of this ice box they were often lined with galvanized metal like this one, or with wood or tile or slate. And they were insulated with anything from mineral wool to charcoal, cork, or flax straw fibers. The ice went into the top because cold settles downward, of course, and a rubber tube would route the dripping water into a pan under the ice box that needed to be emptied daily, usually a child's job. In the home, the family needed some tools to move and ship ice, and these kind of look like overkill from historic New England's Phillips House. Or to prolong the life of your ice, use an ice blanket. By the first decade of the 20th century, plentiful ice meant an explosion of chilled and frozen desserts at home. Today, one of the few uses that we see for large blocks of ice, which are almost all made artificially, are ice sculptures. For a special event or a winter festival, they make quite a beautiful sight and might also chill your shrimp or vodka. Or how about visiting the Winter Carnival at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire? It's coming up February 9th to 12th, and there's a pirate theme this year. You can still find some ice cutting demonstrations in the Midwest, Canada, and northern New England, but it's extremely rare to find a place like Rocky Wool Deep Haven Camp on Squam Lake in Holderness, New Hampshire, that harvest ice every year for use in their cabins' ice boxes all the way until September. I encourage you to visit their website with a lot of great history and videos. Of course, the days of the natural ice industry were really numbered with the growing popularity of the electric refrigerator. This first model General Electric was called a monitor top, was invented by engineer Christian Steenstrup in 1927. It was considered the first affordable and compact refrigeration unit for home use. Unfortunately, this generation of fridges was cooled with poisonous chemicals like sulfur dioxide. The use of safer Freon and increasing consumer power in the mid-20th century really did the old icebox in, and electric refrigerators were in most kitchens after World War II. Thanks to today's interest in all things antique, you can get oak panels and cover your modern refrigerator to make it look like an icebox. And you can eat your ice cream any time of the year and reflect how fortunate we are to have so many choices for our meals thanks to modern conveniences. Well, here's a trade card from Historic New England's archives that has a wonderful picture of a little girl with a white mountain icebox. And I believe this is the same company that began in Laconia in 1872 and moved to Nashua in the 1880s. And I'm very happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that you might have. Thanks so much for your attention.
Jane, thank you so much. That's fascinating. It's interesting to write it there at the end, talking about Laconia. It's right next to where I live. And that ice, I remember that. It brought back some old memories of that ice company being in use. It's so funny.
That's fantastic.
Let's see here. Gloria, please help me out in case I'm missing anything. I'll go back here a little bit and see if we have any questions. Lots of thank yous, excellent presentation,
Oh, nice.
some funny stories.
Oh, the Three Stooges.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's also ice harvesting jokes, the ice saws. It's fine if you're the person on the top of the ice, but who's the poor sucker on the bottom, right?
Right. Let's see.
Our farm's ice house had stopped being filled during World War II and collapsed in the 1950s. Yeah, that's a story that I hear a lot because, of course, it's costly to maintain buildings that you just don't need to use anymore.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, we'll give some people some time if they come up with any questions. One thing that I thought was interesting as you were talking about the process back in the day and how the children like to ride the ice blocks. And of course, as a mother of a small child, I was just like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine letting my child do that. And then, of course, the questions that were raising in my head, you started talking about some of the accidents that would happen, but glad to hear it wasn't as common with the people falling in the ice as it was for the animals and the farm equipment. Not that that's good, but
Well, I guess they didn't lose anybody anyway. They knew what to do. Pat Burke said that when that tractor fell in the ice, fell in the water of Lake Potanabo, the other workers saw the tractor go in with the driver, and so they immediately got off the ice and drove on the road over to where he was, and they were able to, he was able to, the driver was able to get himself out of the lake, and then they were able to take him back and get him warm quickly.
Oh, good. I'm sure they had lots of safety precautions for things like that happening. David Bolduck is asking, was the harvesting significant enough to lower the level of the lake? That's a good question.
That's a very good question, David. And I suppose it depended on which lake or pond you're talking about and how extensive the ice harvesting operation was. I'd imagine that in a place like Brookline or Spy Pond, for example, that it would have some effect on the level, but I don't know the answer to that, and you've given me the opportunity to look something up new for my next talk, or hopefully we can maybe add it to when this is posted, we could add that answer somewhere.
Yeah, that's interesting. Let's see here. Carolyn, she has a camp on Lake Winnisquam, still has an ice house, now used as a wood house. That's really cool.
Oh, I love it. Adaptive reuse. Yep.
Right.
Every building needs life in it in order for it to keep going.
One of the things you had mentioned about that I'd never heard of is them cutting the ice and then pushing the snow down so that the ice could form on top of it. That's really interesting that they would think to do that. I've never heard of that method before.
I hadn't either, and it seemed really clever to me, and seemed dangerous that they would kind of score the ice and cut it enough so that the snow would fall through, but not the people. Yeah, so that you had to be really skilled to figure that out.
Exactly. Oh, the Thompson Ice House Museum in South Bristol, Maine. Have you ever heard of that?
I have not. my goodness, I'm going to have to keep going north to Maine now. But that sounds like a great place to visit. Thanks for that, Stephen.
Mhm.
And Christine said to me that she used to play in the Eustis Ice House too, next door to my uncle's house in Milton. Oh my goodness, that is so great. And she's going to share the posted talk with her family and friends.
Oh,
Yeah,
fun.
and if you visit Eustis House today, it's a great museum to visit. They have a great print of that picture right in the kitchen at the Eustis Estate, and you can go and see the pond. The ice house itself is no longer there.
Hmm. See, I had a feeling this was going to happen, that you were going to cover a lot in your presentation, so we don't have as many questions. But Doug is also mentioning Musterfield Farm in North Sutton still harvests ice on Keyser Lake.
Oh, that's
That's
great.
that's one I didn't know about too. That's great.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you still have, out of 1,000 lakes, you must have many that are still nice and pure, and the weather cold enough to freeze it, enough inches that it's useful to harvest, and people who are willing to do all that hard work.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'd be interested to. I'm gonna have to look up tomorrow to see if Squam is gonna be doing it this year. So we certainly don't have much ice up here. Lake Winnipesaukee is not frozen as it typically is. And I'm not sure about Squam, so
Hmm.
we'll see.
Maybe this
Uh,
weekend will help out with that.
yes, I would think so. Let's see. Tom is mentioning that Harry Kirkwood ran the last ice house in Terryville, Connecticut on Middle Pond.
Hmm. I'll also have to do more research in southern New England.
Yeah. Well, I guess people don't have many questions, but lots of interesting places to share for all of us to check out after this presentation, get our interest piqued and what else might be going on in New England. So thank you so much, Jane, for joining us and for giving us a wealth of information about ice harvesting and the history. I thank you so much.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, everybody, for joining us at the talk.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, have a good night.